Back on the road, back on the road, and back on the road, back on the road, city cycle.
Hi folks, so thank you for stopping by. If you would like to learn how to build a camper van like this yourself, then please check out my other YouTube videos. So if you guys have found these videos helpful, you can help me out in a big way by picking up a copy of my first ever album that my brother and I recorded in Nashville late last year. Any proceeds will go to future recording projects, as well as taking the band on tour and hopefully promoting it. I'll leave a link in the description and talk a little bit more about it at the end of this video.
Okay folks, apologies firstly, I've got a cold, but I'm going to talk you through making the bed. So one thing I find really helpful to do at this point is to put anything in place that is going to be underneath your bed. So I've got my toilet here, the cool box, power management unit, I've got a battery that's going to be here. That's going to help me design my bed and work out the dimensions. So it's really helpful to draw something out, I find, and then you can work out the design and exactly how much timber you're going to need to purchase. So when you're designing your bed, you've got to think of a few things. So firstly, the length. The DVLA in this country ask that you build a bed that's at minimum of 6 feet long, so you've got to consider that into your build. And you're also going to want to consider your height, so you're going to want to figure out how much storage you need. If you've got a van you can stand up in, then it's pretty limitless. Here, obviously, I've got a different problem here because my van is so low, I obviously don't want to build it too high that you then can't sit upright whilst you're sat in the van. So a few things to think about. We're going to be using 18 by 44 millimeter timber and 18 by 18 millimeter timber for this project. And what I've done when I've been designing it, I've split it into 3 parts. So I've got the top frame, which you can imagine would be this bit on the kitchen unit. You've got the bottom frame, which everything's going to sit on, and then you've got your supporting pieces of timber like this that are going to join it all together to create that rectangular shape. So I'll split that into 3. I'll try and show you on here how I've done that. So there's my top base there, pretty straightforward. My bottom base isn't so straightforward because, as you can see here, I have to work around the wheel arch. Also, I can't put a piece of timber straight across here because things like the toilet and the cool box need to slide in and out. So there's a few things to think about as well when you're designing it. And then I've got my supporting beams here, and then what I've done is I've worked out all the dimensions of those, worked out all the maths, and then I've gone to Wix and I've bought all the timber that I need, and I know now that I obviously won't have bought too much, or I also haven't bought not enough. The first thing we need to do is work out the length of our bed. So I'm going to measure up to the end of my kitchen unit here because I want it to come out at the same point as my kitchen unit so they look flush with each other. But obviously measure yours to fit within your own dimensions. So I'll take our first measurement to this piece of timber then. I'll mark out 155.5. Righty. I butt it up against the bench unit there. You can see that fits quite nicely. So we'll go and make that same cut. Okay, so next up we want to measure the width for our bed so we can make that cut. And when you're doing this, you basically want to make your base for the bench seat just over half the total width of your bed once it's in the pulled out form. So what I mean by that is if I take a measurement across here on the kitchen unit to my wall, mine is 90 centimetres. Okay, so half of that will be 45 centimetres. But I don't want to cut it to 45 centimetres because once I start pulling the slats out, they'll slip out of place. So we've got to allow an extra few centimetres or so to allow the slats to sit on top of the bench seat. So half of my total width of 90 centimetres here will be 45 centimetres. So I'm going to allow 48 centimetres for the actual bench seat part. For our width piece, we know the measurement is going to be 48 centimetres in my case, but I want it to sit within these 2 long boards. So I'm also going to need to subtract the width of both of these long boards. Each one is 44 millimetres wide, so that's a total of 88 millimetres for the 2 of them. So I'm now going to subtract 88 millimeters of 48 centimeters. That's going to leave me with 39.2 centimeters, and that will now sit flush in between these two long boards here. If you find yourself with a lot of splintered edges, it's probably because you're not using the correct blade. It's the only one I've got, so I'm going ahead and using this one. So what you can do if you can't afford to get another one is you could just sand the edges using some 80 grit sandpaper just to take that edge off before you go ahead and join it all, and before it ends up in your hand. So there it is in place. It'll sit nicely in there. This will be our top frame. We need one more of these across this side, and then we can start sectioning it off as well. So it's really important when you're doing these cuts that the pieces for the width and the pieces for the length are all the same size, to make sure that it's all nice and square. So a top tip for making sure that it is you could clamp two pieces together like we have done previously and cut them both at once so you know they're both exactly the same size. Or you can actually create a spacer where you can clamp a piece up here, and then all you have to do is just push it up to the clamped piece, and you'll know you're going to get the exact same size piece of wood. I'm also going to make sure this is flush this side and draw a line down here so I know it's going to be exactly the same size. We'll go ahead and check it after each cut as well. Nice. So that piece is going to fit in there. We're going to have another one across this side, and it's going to form this rectangular shape for our top base. Again, if you don't have a wheel arch or anything like that in your way, you can make these exact same cuts for your base as well. Alright, so let's go ahead and join these pieces. So I'm going to be using one of these Craig pocket hole jigs. If you don't know how to use one of these, you can go to my wheel arch boxes video, and there's a good explanation on there on how to use one. So let's make sure it's set up. Suggest if you haven't used one of these before, that doing a project like the wheel arch box is a good one to start on, because it's not overly important. So we're going to set our thickness here to 19 millimeters. The actual thickness of my wood here is 18 millimeters, so this is the nearest I have to it. I'm going to take our first little piece, clamp it into place as always, and then using the high setting on my drill, I can then start drilling the pocket holes. We want two in here. And same on the other side as well. Give this a quick wipe down. Make sure we can get it nice and flush. Okay, so we're ready to cut our first piece together. I'm using 18mm thick timber here, but you can of course use thicker if it's 18mm isn't available to you. I wouldn't go any thinner than 18mm because you need some fairly decent structural support for this if you're going to be putting your weight on it. So what we're going to do next is change over our drill bit. Making sure that we change our speed setting as well, so it's a bit slower. We're going to need some wood glue for this. I'm using Gorilla Wood glue again. And some screws. Now to work out which size screws you need, you can find it out from the owner's manual. So there's a chart which lists the different thicknesses of the wood, and then as you go along it will tell you which size screw you need. So for 19mm thick wood you need a screw length of 32mm, which these are, or 1 1/4 inches. As mine's 18mm, that's as close as I'm going to be, so I'm going to use these. So as always, we want to make sure we're using plenty of clamps. I'm going to do this side first, so we're going to add some wood glue onto the bottom here. And we can press the two pieces together. This clamp is very handy in this situation. Make sure this is accurate now, because otherwise you won't get a clean joint. Okay, so make sure your edges are butted up against each other nicely. You've got a nice finish across the top as well. And go ahead, put one of your pocket hole screws in and screw it down. So you feel it bite, and then you can let go. Okay, then you can release your clamp. Let's go ahead and put the other screw in as well. So yeah, that's got a nice seamless finish there. Wipe away any excess glue if there is any, and then we can go ahead and we can do the same up on this side as well. Now that's done, we can go ahead and do the other side. Cool, so with my top frame here roughly in place, because I've got so many things underneath here, I'm actually going to go along and just mark all the edges where I want each area divided off. Of course, if you're just using your bed simply for storage purposes, you won't need to do this, you can skip this part. But if you have loads of little bits like I do that are going to be stored underneath it separately, then this is what you've got to do. So I'm going to help divide these bits by putting in these dividing pieces across the top part of my frame. So I'm going to go and cut all of these to size. Alright, so it's going to look something like that. Got our pocket holes, now let's glue it all together. Glue and screw, that's the name of the game. Okay, so they're all joined together and you can sort of roughly see how it's all laid out and sectioned off now on my bed. So with our top base done, what you would normally do is go and mimic the same thing for the bottom base. Because my bottom base is a little complicated, because I'm working on this wheel arch here, and also it's not running straight across there because I need to allow the toilet and the cool box to come out, I'm actually going to do my supporting beams first. That are all coming down here. So if you can see that at all, I have about 12 of these to do. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut them all and then I can attach them. Now if you are going to be putting the bottom base on and then joining the two, you're going to need to subtract the top base and the bottom base from your total height. Okay, so I've got two pieces of this timber. I'm using 18 by 44mm again. So we're going to put some pocket holes now into our supporting beams. If you've got a top and a bottom base, then you're going to need to put two pocket holes, both on the bottom end and the top end of these. Okay, I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to start attaching these onto my top base. Make sure that both sides are free of any debris, because it's going to stop you getting a nice clean finish. But I would suggest putting a couple of supporting beams in here somewhere just to help carry your weight as you're sat or led on the bed. No offence. Okay, so just to give you an idea of how it's looking so far, so now you can sort of see where I've sectioned all of these parts off and all the legs are on now. One thing I'm going to point out is because I had a bit of a groove here that was hard to fit into, I cut the corner off of this bit here, but it also means that my leg won't be able to butt up right against the end. So what I'm going to do is cut the same groove on the leg so that it will butt straight up to the rear end of the, I'm saying butt and rear end a lot. Great, so to do this then I'm going to set my table saw here at a 45-degree angle. Great, so as you can see I've set my table saw blade at a 45-degree angle. Now I can go ahead and pass it through. So that should fit quite nicely now. So if you don't have a wheel arch in the way or anything like that, then of course you can make your legs here go all the way to the ground from the top base here. If you do have a wheel arch, I'm now going to have to measure from that point down to the wheel arch, and the same on this side, so I can get a nice flush fit with the wheel arch and give it a little bit of extra support. And as if by magic, the two legs have appeared. So there we go, all the legs are in now. I can start tying up the legs across the bottom here, so I will join these two together, for example these two and those, but like I said before, because we've got a toilet and a cool box that are going to need to be pulled in and out, I'm not going to join these bottom parts so that they have room to slide across the floor. So instead I've put the pocket holes, I don't know if you can see that, the pocket holes in the bottom of the legs there, so that I can screw it right into the floor of the van so that it's going to be nice and firm and it's not going to move around anywhere. Okay, so I've taken the bed back out and I'm going to take some measurements now because there's some areas that I'm going to be connecting up along the baseline. So here will be my toilet, this is where this will sleep, so I'm going to need to slide this in and out. I don't want to put something across here because it's obviously going to obstruct its ability to be pulled in and out. But I do want to be joining sections up here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some measurements off the marks that I've made, write them down, and then I'm going to go and cut some pieces and again join it using pocket hole joinery to complete our entire frame for the bed. Okay, and as before then, I'm going to take our pieces and I'm going to use pocket hole joinery to join these all together. So I'll go ahead now, I'm going to add all my pocket holes to all of these pieces and then I'll change the drill bit over and start gluing and screwing them down all at once. Okay, so now we're ready to add our base parts. Just remember that you want your pocket holes to be showing away wherever possible so then you don't have to fill these later. It's going to be butted up against the bench seat, so I'm going to have these facing this way so that you won't see them as they'll be butted up against the bench seat from there. So again, we'll just glue and screw these as we go. Alrighty folks, so we've finished all of our framing now, so we can move on to boarding the bed seat if we need to anywhere. So the first thing we're going to do is board up the battery compartment, and I'll also board up where the power management unit is. Like I said before, we're going to have a drawer here, cool box and the fridge. They all need to be pulled in and out, so we don't want to board up any of that. So for the battery compartment, I'm going to use the same technique we've done here on the kitchen unit. I'm going to use tongue and groove on the outside here, so we have a similar finish. It's really important with your battery compartment that you board up all areas. We don't want anything falling into the battery compartment, touching the terminals and possibly destroying our circuit while it's being used. So it's really important that nothing can get inside and drop on those terminals. You can alternatively buy a battery box, so it's like a plastic box that the battery will fit in and that will keep it nice and safe. I don't have one that fits the battery that I've got, so hence why I'm going to board all of this area up. And for this bit here, because we've got a bit of a groove, we're going to go ahead and we're going to use our scribing technique and we're going to scribe around this edge to get a nice fit. So first up then, let's take some measurements. 34.9. Alright, 5 done and 1. Great, so with our first workpiece clamped in place, I can now go ahead and scribe around this little groove here of the van. So to do that, we take our compass, butt it up against the grooved area, and then we guide it along and our pencil will draw out our cut line. So you may have to go over it a few times. Now I can go and cut this with a jigsaw and then I can make any minor alterations as I go if it doesn't quite fit. So we can attach this one if we want to and then we can start boarding up the rest. Before I go ahead and take the bed frame out, I've put our piece right up against the side of the van, and then I've drawn a line down the two sides here, just so that I know exactly where I need to attach this piece of tongue and groove, so that when I go and put the bed frame back in place, we know that it's going to sit nicely right up against the van. So as you can see, we've clamped that workpiece into place, so we know it's not going to move. We're going to now glue and screw this in. First of all, we need to drill a pilot hole, as always. So I'm going to put a couple of screws in. So one pilot hole here in the middle. I find that even though these are supposed to be countersunk screws, they still tend to split the wood a little bit sometimes. If you take your countersunk piece, take this out of place, and then just countersink it, pressing firmly down on here. We don't want to go too deep. But basically, because later on we're going to be filling these holes, we want to make sure that the head of the screw is going to be deep enough so that the screw head won't be showing when we fill it with wood filler a little bit later. Side. So what we can do now is we're going to take our drill bit that fits the head exactly. Remember, we don't want to get one that's too small because otherwise it will strip the head of the screw, especially with these smaller ones. You want a nice tight fit there. Turn your drill down to a bit of a slower setting. And now we're going to add a bit of glue across the top and the bottom of our workpiece here. Okay, using that Gorilla Wood glue again. That's why I think it's good to get a big bottle like this, because we do end up using a lot. Alternatively, if you didn't want to fill the holes later, you could just glue all of these on probably. Put it in place, 2 lines. We can take one of our screws. So now you can see my screw head is deeper than the timber. So we now know that when we fill it, it's not going to be showing. So we'll go ahead and put all the screws in. The most important thing when you're doing this is that the tongue and groove isn't going to be too low at the bottom, because if it is, then you're not going to be able to get this firmly on the floor. It's going to raise the bed. So if there's a little bit showing up here, we can correct this later. What's handy now is that the next boards, because they don't have any curves to fit to, should be quite straightforward. I should be able to now just slot these in, and I could go ahead and screw several in as we go along. For this last piece here, we just have this small section to complete. What I'm going to do is I'm going to slot this into place, okay, making sure it's butted up correctly, and then I'm going to use the edge here of the bed unit to draw down with my pencil. And then I'll get a nice accurate line of where I need to finish. Cut this last piece using the table saw to make sure we get a nice straight edge that's going to butt up nicely against this side piece. So what I'm going to actually do with this one, because it's so small, I'm actually going to, I think, just glue it as opposed to screwing it as well. Leave that for a few hours and then we'll come back. So I wanted to countersink these screws. I'm now going to go over them with some wood filler. I'm going to press this into the screw head as we have done before. Fill those in. I'm going to go around all the screw heads and do this, and then later on we'll sand it back so it's nice and flush with the timber here itself, and then we should get a fairly clean finish once it's sanded that we can then paint over. You won't be able to see those screws anymore. I'm going to leave that wood filler to dry, and then we'll sand it a little bit later on. Now I can go ahead and I can tongue groove this side here and also this bit here. I'm not going to do it totally the same. I'm not going to countersink the holes and then fill the screw heads. I'm going to leave the screws on show because they'll be internal instead of external, so no one's going to see them unless you're accessing the battery, which isn't going to be very often. So to save me a bit of time, I'm going to leave them showing this time round. But I'm just going to go ahead, do the same again. We're going to make the measurements, cut the boards to size, and then glue and screw them together. Whilst I'm waiting for this to dry, I'm actually going to make my frame now to mount my power management unit on. So the power management unit being the place where all the fuses are, where everything's basically connected to. So as you can see here, there's like 4 little stops. You can remove these, one in each corner, pull these out,
and then you can use a screw to drive through there and attach it to a wooden frame. So that's how you would mount this unit, and I'm going to mount mine underneath the bed frame because this is where all my electrics are heading to. So to do this then, what we need to do is take some dimensions. So getting your tape measure, we're going to measure the internal diameter of the width and the length here. So the length is 28.3 and the width is 13.1. So make a note of that, 13.1 and 28.3. We're also going to need to measure this section as well. So mine in particular is going to be 16.7 by 31.3. So we know that we need to make the frame for this bit, which I'm going to be gluing and screwing into here. We know we need to make it fit into here, but we need a big enough gap for that to simply slot into place. So we'll go ahead and make that next using those dimensions. So to work out the thickness of the wood that I need, I've taken the length of the bed frame and the length of the internal side of my power management unit, and I've subtracted them from one another. So 31.3 minus 28.3, that gives me 3.0. So I know that's how thick that piece of wood needs to be to allow it to fit inside my bed frame and fit around the edge of the power management unit. And then I'll do the same again with both the widths, 16.7 minus 13.1, and that leaves me with 3.6. So I'm going to go and take that to the table saw. So we've only got 3.6 centimeters of space left for our frame to fit in the width, and because I'm going to be putting two pieces of wood in, I would therefore need to divide that by 2. So 3.6 divided by 2 means these need to be 1.8 centimeters thick each. Yeah, now two pieces are exactly the same height, and we know, hopefully if I can show you over here, so I know that when this is in place, that these two pieces will fit behind here within the frame, will fit behind there as well, if you can see what I mean, okay? Now that we have our length pieces in place, we can now do the width, and we know that it's going to be as long as the internal width of our power management unit here, which we've already written down, which for me was 13.1, would be the same for you if you're using the same unit. Cool, so I've just cut that to length. I can see that that fits. Now what I need to do is I need to go and cut this down. We were left with 3 centimeters space here, so I need to cut this down into two pieces, both 1.5 centimeters thick. So hopefully you can see my internal frame now. I'm going to try to push this through without knocking all of the pieces out. I'm ready to start installing this part. So I'm going to have to go in a little bit of an angle to get these in because this part is in the way. One thing that I'm going to say is I'm actually pushing my frame further back. I don't want the frame coming right out here because otherwise my power management unit is going to be straight out here, and it's going to be easy to knock those switches with your feet as you're sitting on the bed. So hence why I'm actually putting this deeper into the frame. So it's flush with the back end here. I'm going to add a couple of pilot holes here for the screws, and then we can go ahead and glue and screw it in. Okay, I'm going to countersink those as well, because obviously we don't want our screw heads poking out, otherwise we're not going to be able to push our power management unit through. Okie dokie! Right, let's give this some glue. Put this in place. Wipe away any excess glue if there is any. We can go ahead and install the other bits. Got 3 more sides to do. You can see the frame in place. Fingers crossed this is going to fit. We're going to pop out the little black stops here. Show you an example, and then we can whack the screws in there. Alrighty, so you do find that your tongue groove boards are poking up slightly above your bed frame, you can go ahead and sand it with some 60 grit sandpaper if it's just a little bit over, and that will take the edge off. If you're a bit further out, then well, you should really cut the boards to a closer size first and get that more accurate before doing anything else. Cool, so whilst we're here we can also go ahead and we can sand down all those screw heads that we filled in with wood filler earlier. Alrighty, they're nice and flattened down now. We'll be painting over this a little bit later. So what you can do now is go over the whole thing with sort of 80 grit sandpaper, and then I go down to a 240 grit sandpaper just to give it a nice smooth finish, and then you should be ready to go and paint. Just before we sand, I'm going to fill in these pocket holes. I'm not going to fill these in because I'm going to use those pocket holes to screw the bed here into the floor of the van. Of course, if you've got your full-on base where you have nothing interrupting it, you could simply put some screws into the base part of your frame into the floor itself, so you wouldn't need these. I'm going to use these. These are pine. I'm just going to put a little bit of glue on them, and then I'm going to push them up into there. Shove them up there. Just try and push them in as far as you possibly can. Okay, so we're going to go around to all of these and do that, and then we'll leave that glue to dry, and then we can come back and sand them down using a really coarse piece of sandpaper, like 60 grit. So while I'm waiting for a few things to dry, I'm going to go ahead and take some measurements for the leg of my slat frame. So the slat frame is going to be identical to the face of this bed frame here. So I'm literally going to be copying all of this to make my leg for the slats to sit on. So if you can imagine, this is part of the leg. The slats are going to be sat across here. They're going to be connected to this piece of timber, the entire leg. And then as we pull it out this way, it will extend what is a bench seat into a bed. And there'll be the legs coming down here. So I'm going to go ahead, take all the measurements. The reason I'm doing it the same as the face of the bed is so that there are no indifferences between the two. So when it's closed, they'll look exactly the same, and it should make it look a bit more seamless. So go ahead and take some dimensions now of the face of your bed. Okay, so after taking my measurements, I found out that 3 pieces are all going to be of the same length, so I've clamped them together. This is especially important when we're doing the legs, because if one is longer than the other, then it's obviously not going to reach the floor. The thickness of the pieces of wood, by the way, for the slat frame are the exact same thickness as the face of the bed frame here. The reason being is so that they are both the same size as you're looking at them. So in this instance, these are 18 millimeters thick. I like it to be a little bit thicker, but basically just follow the thickness of the face of your bed frame for this part. So as you can see then, I've cut all my pieces to the same dimension as the face of the bed frame here. So all I'm basically going to do now is using pocket hole joinery, as we have done previously, is join this all together. Using some measurements taken from the face of our bed frame, I can then work out where to place all my legs. Don't forget, you want your pocket holes to be facing away so that you don't see them as you're looking directly at the slat frame. So as you can see, this frame here has completely copied the face of the bed frame across there. Okay, so we've left this to dry overnight, and I'm going to go at it with some 60 grit sandpaper. So you can see that's slowly wearing it down. Once it gets pretty much flush, I can then move on to the next one, and then we'll finally go around the whole thing with some 240 grit sandpaper to make it all nice and smooth to the touch. So just to show you, we've gone from that to that once sanded. Cool, so just follow that all the way around now with a 240 grit sandpaper until everywhere is nice and smooth to the touch. And then you can go ahead, give it a brush up. Great, so once you're all finished up sanding, give your workstation, if you've got a workstation, if you can call it that, this manky old table, give it a quick brush. We don't want any of that debris left from sanding to affect our paintwork. Also make sure that your bed unit itself is also nice and free of debris. So I'm going to use my official paint stirring tool. So we'll end up giving this a couple of coats. It says on the tin here to put 2 coats. of this particular paint on, but just follow whatever it says on your tin. See, each paint's different, some might need 3. One thing to think about is you need to be able to lock your slat frame here into place so that when the vehicle's in transit, this leg here isn't going to be moving around, and once the bed's actually pulled out, it's going to stay where it needs to be. So one thing you can do is you could use a straight bolt like we have done on the kitchen units, or alternatively you could do this, where I've taken a flat bit. This is a 12mm flat bit, and then I've taken a 12mm dowel, and I've basically drilled that circle out into the bottom of the leg, and that will push in with a bit of wood glue to keep that in place. And I'll also make a hole in the floor in 2 different places, one where it will sit when it's in its sort of bench seat position when the slats are closed, and there'll be another place for this to slot into when the bed is actually open and in use, so that it will hold it into place. So I'm going to go along and I'm actually going to put one of these dowels all across here. So one thing I do is I go up to the base of the leg. I know mine's 18mm, so I mark it off at 9mm, and then I do the same using the other way. So I've got a nice cross in the middle then, so I know exactly where to drill into. And you need to make sure that you keep your drill as straight as possible when you do this. Cool, so I'm not going to go too deep, just enough to let the dowel sit inside, remove any of the sawdust. And then I'm going to go ahead and get some wood glue. We'll pour some into there, and then we can place our dowel in and make sure that I've covered all the areas. You can go ahead and do this to all your legs. Great, so as you can see, our bed frame is now in place, so I've got to go ahead and screw it down. So you can either screw your pieces of furniture like this into place, you can rivet them, you can bolt them down. So you've got a few different options. I find this is one of the easiest ones to do. Put a few clamps here just to keep my bed frame in place, and I'm going to put a screw directly down here. I'm going to first of all drill a pilot hole, as we always do when we're drilling into wood, just to make sure it doesn't split. And I'm going to keep my drill at a really nice right angle just to make sure it doesn't go out either side. And I want to get as far as the floor here because that's what I want to screw it into. So here we go. And then what I like to do, just to tidy up the appearance a little, is to countersink this. There we go, that's just going to help the head of the screw sit down nicely without it splitting the wood. And of course find our drill bit that's going to fit the head of the screw nicely so it doesn't strip it, and we can screw it down. Because we've drilled a pilot hole, it should find its way through okay, and the wood won't split. So for this section of the bed frame, if you remember, we put a few pocket holes in, so I'm going to put a few screws into those pocket holes, clamp it a little, and screw these down. So if you use that technique on anything, you can go ahead and fill those pocket holes. Great, so what you want to do then is just go around the entire bed frame, just make sure everything is really secure. I mean, I've got several pocket holes screwed into the floor there, a couple at the back. I'll probably put 1 or 2 into the wall itself to secure it in place, and you also want to make sure there's at least a couple that are going all the way through the base of the van, just to make sure it's nice and secure if there ever was an accident. Okay, so now we need to create some holes for our leg to sit in, the dowel part of the leg I mean. So it would sit in like so into this hole, for example. It won't sit all the way in because I haven't done all the others yet. As you can see, I've made a few markings. One thing you could do is you could either put the leg in place and then try and draw around the dowel. I know exactly where to put my flat bit then. And remember to use a flat bit that's the same size as your dowel. So I've got a 12mm dowel, so we've got a 12mm flat bit to make sure that fits nice and snugly. So we'll do all the ones across the bed frame first, and then we can do the ones that are going to be further out once the leg is pulled out. So I'm not going all the way down so that my van floor is showing. Next up we're going to create our slats then, so we need to take 2 measurements. Okay, so we're going to need one measurement where the permanent slats that stay in place are going to be. So that's going to be from basically one side of your bed frame to the other, and then your second dimension is going to be from the one end of your bed frame all the way to the end of the slat frame. So for instance, 50.1 and 48.2. This is 18mm by 44mm. As you can see, I've clamped 3 pieces together, so go ahead and just make all of your cuts. You can use this technique to save you a bit of time. All along here. Just put them in roughly for now. Right, so with our bed slats done, the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to fix half of these into place. So these slightly longer ones here are actually going to be attached to the slat leg that's going to draw them in and out like so. So these ones here are going to be fixed permanently into place, therefore I'm going to screw them in. So the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to use a drill bit to drill a pilot hole. So we can go in on this side and this side, and we can countersink it and add a screw. Now it's important that we countersink every single screw head because our foam is going to be led over the top of this, and of course we don't want it to get caught on the screw heads themselves, and we want it to be all nice and flush. Cool. And then finally we can go ahead and add our screws. I'm using some 3.5mm wide screws, and they are 30mm long, so it's not so long that they're going to come out the other side of the wood, but they're going to hold on to the bed frame itself. Because it's countersunk, look, it's going to be hidden flush with the slat itself. Great, there we go. Our first slat is now fixed into place. We want to make sure there's a little bit of a gap for these movable slats to move in and out, so do allow a little bit of room for that, but you can go ahead and fix all of the fixed slats into place. So we're going to follow the same procedure with these longer slats as we did with the shorter ones. We'll drill a pilot hole first, countersink that hole, and then put the screws through, except here we're going to have 2 screws on this side and no screws on the other, and this will allow the slat to move freely. Great, so now you can see our bed frame all pulled out, looking kind of like a bed. The only thing I'm a bit unhappy with is that it doesn't have the smoothest sort of in and out action. I think I'd actually put these slats a little too tight with each other, so my recommendation would be to just allow a little bit more room between the slats that are actually pulling open and the ones that are fixed onto the bed itself. Anyway, we're going to go ahead next and we're going to add some more hole cutouts. Remember we put the dowels in the slat frame leg thing here. We put some dowels in the bottom so that we could kind of lock it into place into the floor. So I'm going to go ahead and put a few holes along this side now, according to where they end up at their widest point. So you find your widest point on your frame and you can mark out where you're going to make your holes. So a few things then, we've got all our holes in place, and that will allow our leg here for our slats to slot into those holes. Just make sure it's really sturdy and it doesn't get accidentally knocked over. I did actually take all of the thick slats off, and I shaved a couple of millimeters off each side because it was far too tight to get the moving slats in and out. So I would definitely recommend allowing, well, I probably allowed a few millimeters there, I'd say 2 or 3 millimeters either side, just to make it really easy to pull that bed in and out. And also another thing I did to make it easier to move the bed in and out from the seat to the bed position was I added this piece of timber all across the back here. This is an 8mm thick piece of timber, and basically when I was closing the bed and putting it back into the seat position, these moving slats would start going downwards into the bed unit itself, and therefore they didn't meet the ridge at the back here. It was a real pain to close it. So by putting this piece of timber across the back, and I've just screwed it into each moving slat, I'm now able to move it in and out really smoothly because it just rides across the fixed slats. Try and show you it in action then. So I just have to pull it out of the holes that we cut out earlier, like so, and then I can just pull it forward until we meet the other holes that we've created in the floor, and then it should slot into place. And there we have it, look. and then I can go ahead and start chucking cushions on top of there. Happy days. So we used an 8mm thick piece of timber across the back of those slats there, and because it's fairly thin, as you can see, it hasn't affected the position of our seat cushion much. Thanks for stopping by, everybody. Please like and subscribe and check out our other content on all things camper. As I mentioned before, I've just recorded my first album. We'll need all the help I can get, so I'll leave you with an album preview for now and a link in the description if you'd like to pick up a copy.
She does all that she can. Yes, anymore. Time, I'm heading west, yeah, till I cross the line. $6 short, but my soul is clean. I need one more dime. The fruit machine swirling waves on me. Yeah. You put their cold and harsh demeanor, it'll soon come